Okay, this is great. I'm so glad Brian Bartlett's here. Brian is from the Department of English here at St. Mary's. He's a member of the School of the Environment, and he teaches two really neat-sounding courses. The Writer in Nature and Canadian Nature Writing. And today, and I'm going to see if I can say this right, but Brian might have a better, accent for it. Bittersweet, sweet, bittersweet, sweet. The Poetics and Politics of Writing a Nature Calendar. Brian, thanks for coming.
April the 3rd. Two black dogs off their leashes lunged along the evening beach, excited, as if in attack mode, but ignored us and sped into further freedom and space. Over the ocean an hour later, sun dogs glowed on either side of the horizon-halved sun, light caught in ice fog's crystals, fractured, comet-like, the sun's surrogates or pets. We might have called the evening concentration, there at a beach named Crystal Crescent. May the 12th. By the broader, brighter trails, the fiddlehead shapes are gone, replaced by ferns in all their height and breadth. Then you find yourself in a deeper, darker part of the forest, down where sunlight has a hard time reaching, and you come across more clusters of ferns to be. In the muck, all those question marks with their compact and concentrated heads. This green village, still on the edge of transformation. May 13th. Days on a small island without electricity or running water, rope, birth, and death extra tightly together. Gull chicks an hour old, purple skin, soaked feathers. From their underground burrows, storm petrels staccato purr through their midnight mating. A dead minke whale stench in its shining, bristled baleen. On my knees, I cradle in my hand a seal's seawater-washed jawbone with all its teeth intact. June the 8th. Let's hear it for Leonard, the feisty bantam rooster so black beside the white rolling with fat chickens. Too lean and muscled to be slaughtered, he'd flap his wings at Diefenbaker, the black lab, rush at us and go for our ankles. His motto, be Leonard. The night a skunk massacred the chickens, Leonard hid behind a crate. But the chaos was too much. The great entertainer who undid our laces with his beak died of fright. That's interesting. Sometimes people laugh at that one, but it's grisly humor, so maybe this is a more compassionate audience. June 21st, and this one alludes to a very famous poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Rhyme of Ancient Mariner, or he quotes it actually. June 21st, oil, oil. Slicked brown pelican, oil, oil. Flightless horned grebe, oil, oil. Crow-colored vesper sparrow, oil, oil. Golden plover, no longer gold, oil, oil. Magnificent frigate bird in need of a name change, oil, oil. The water, like a witch's oils, with my crossbow I shot thee. Black-legged stilt, hooded merganser, oil, oil. Least sandpiper, even less, oil, oil. Fish crow, now with the fishes, water, water. August the 4th. Far past midnight, I wake to the clicking of crickets, which hear each other with their knees' tympanic membranes. In Queen Square, tennis balls and softballs have given way to those insects running a wingtip along the comb-like veins on their opposite wing's underside. While calls around the world ring, cave crickets, sand crickets, Jerusalem crickets, I lie awake, running one big toe along the toes of my other foot. August 31st. Yesterday, a slowly moving cluster of thunderstorm cells, thanks National Weather Service, worked its way through the Annapolis Valley, setting Macintosh and Honeycrisp apples free, only to roll and bruise them on the ground. One vineyard lost 25% of its crop to grape-sized hailstones. Terse on the telephone to a radio operator, a worker offered these words, like 3 grapes or 3 hailstones. This is nature. September 24th. Butterflies have withdrawn from flight, I thought not long ago, but too early. Since then, clouded sulfurs have flicked past in pale yellow, and a morning cloak relaxed its purple-brown wings on a hole-ridden bunchberry leaf. The only almanac worth composing includes inaccurate predictions. If I ever had a crystal ball, by now it would be sharded and thrown into a stream, swift water rushing over the pieces of its certainties. What you've just heard is a small selection of 8 paragraphs from over 440 written between April 2010 and April 2012. Less than 2 years earlier, I joined one of the most famous and infamous forums spawned by contemporary internet technologies. By now, Facebook can be summed up as social networking, only with limited accuracy, since from its narrow origins, it has become many things. A place to record everyday minutiae, ask for information, announce cultural events, display and store photos, spread news of births, deaths, book publications, or music releases, share internet links, express political views, vent, argue, reminisce, and joke. At first I joined because it seemed sensible to educate myself in what my elementary school-age son had ventured into, illegally. Despite my mockery of Facebook at what I imagined as its most navel-gazing, oh no, I've got a wart on my butt, I was curious to see what all the hoopla was about, and figured it might not be wise to condemn what I had no immediate familiarity with. Ironically, I soon became a more dedicated Facebook reader and writer than my son ever would. There was no escaping its irritants and imperfections, waves of excessive banality, threats to privacy if the user isn't careful, a tendency to encourage half-baked ideas and flippant statements, a growing involvement in advertising. But my first year also introduced me to its values. Most of its annoying aspects I found easy to deal with or rush past, a process not unlike that in selectively reading newspapers and magazines. In the spring of 2010, my poet friend Alan Cooper, a genuine friend, not merely a Facebook friend, posted on his Facebook wall a few fragmentary observations of natural scenes around his ancestral home in Albert County, New Brunswick. In response, I soon typed out a report from an afternoon in Halifax County, Nova Scotia. Walked in old sneakers around ancient land outside West Dover on curvy road to Peggy's Cove, boggy, twiggy, scattered with giant erratics shoved there by glaciers, now dotted and streaked with lichens, pitcher plants starting to rise up, crawling junipers inching along rock, bushes far more plentiful than trees, a few coyote scats threaded with hair fur, everywhere golds and browns and rusts. So the project began, the seed was planted, the monster was born. This was the eventual monster. Until then, my experience of Facebook had been human-centered, rarely reflecting the processes and powers, the interrelations and uniquenesses of other than human lives, excluding, of course, tirelessly photographed household cats. Alan's example suggested a gap that might be addressed. At first, the writing of brief paragraphs within the maximum 420-character grid. Does anybody remember that? It used to be that you were limited to 420 characters and no more. At first, the writing of brief paragraphs within the maximum 420-character grid of Facebook updates wasn't really a project. I only expected to write a few field reports or lyric meditations, then move on to something else. But over the next few weeks, the writing developed momentum, a habit stuck, a dream formed. And when walking in a forest or along a beach, I began to feel that having the nature calendar in mind sharpened my eyes and ears. From the beginning, the experiment wasn't just a writing endeavor, but also an activity of non-linguistic exploration perception, feeling, and mood absorbing. Early on, I figured that a few dozen of the paragraphs might compose a book of prose poems, divorced from Facebook and included in my next poetry collection. Then the work grew further. By the first fall, what seems, in retrospect, inevitable emerged, a belief, preposterous or not, that the most valuable route to take was to go whole hog, to continue for a couple of years and write several hundred entries, then select 365, one for each day of the year, interweaving the 2 years into a semi-fictionalized single year. And most books of days only have 365 days, but I thought, what about leap year? So I, quite late in the game, decided to have 366. In the first half a year, I recall one of my favorite examples of mid-20th century American nature writing, Donald Colorado-Petey's 1935 book, An Almanac for Moderns, which is built of 365 short essays and moves from one spring to the next. Also in the background were decades of frequently returning to Thoreau's and Emerson's journals and of having kept my own journal, diary, sometimes sporadically, at other times with tenacious dedication for several decades. An example, even though Thoreau was a diary keeper, this is an amusing one available only through Amazon, because it's one of the Amazon publications, of somebody who went through Thoreau's journals over several decades, and these still appear in Facebook. He basically did I, Thoreau, a Transcendental Day book, and the entries are dated not only by the day of the year, but also by the year. So you're jumping, you know, around 3 decades really, or 2 decades of writing. I have a long section in this presentation that I'll mostly skip over that has a lot of background on the history of the Book of Days, which is something I actually didn't explore much until after finishing my book. I kind of, you know, I knew about it, and I as I say, I'm very fond of this book, but it was only after finishing the book that I sort of decided that I wanted to see some more of the background of it and realize what a variety there is in books of days. This one from the Folio Society, Folio Book of Days, is a compilation, 365 entries, January to December, by many different writers, and many of the entries chosen for this have something to do with the day. You know, it might be a news report, it might be an historic event, it might be a letter that somebody wrote, but they're connected to the particular days, and several people edited this book. So there is a kind of Book of Days which is overseen and edited by someone else. It's not the product of a single consciousness. This one is a product of a single consciousness, but it was not created by the great German poet Rilke. Just a few years ago, somebody created a Book of Days, or 2 people actually created a Book of Days by translating poems of his, sections of poems, sections of his diaries, letters, and so on. And most of them don't have anything particular to do with the day of the year. They're just, you know, it's 365 things to read. Here's a Book of Days, which is a compilation of poems. Some of the poems have something to do with the day, others don't. So it's not like all of the, you know, ones in January, February have snow or anything. That's not the case. This is one, Gilbert White, the great, kind of often considered the godfather of nature writing. I should say the grandfather, not the godfather. Nature writing in English language, with his great book, The Natural History of Selborne. And Gilbert White's year, this is, again, it's subtitled Passages from the Garden Calendar in the Naturalist Journal. So somebody else went to his journals and created a 365-item book. This one, fairly recent, Sinking Creek, a Journal, Environmental Book of Days. This is an interesting one in terms of its structure because it begins on September 23rd and it goes around to the next. All the other ones I've seen begin either on January 1st or they begin, I have a section about that, on March 21st or March 22nd. They begin with the vernal equinox in the spring. So let's skip over those. Yeah, connecting to that. In the foreword to the first of his 2 books of days, Hal Borland, who was a writer for the New York Times, he had a nature column in the New York Times that went for 35, 40 years, thousands of items he did in New York Times. And these are interesting because this one and the other one he did, if you look at the back again, you will see how many years he dipped into. So one thing that I became fascinated by is how he was able to construct a book with entries from the 1940s up to the 1960s, and all seems to sort of hold together. But today, I don't think that's as likely to happen, simply because the great changes that are happening in the natural world, that if you compressed it all into a kind of quasi-fictional single year, there's going to be something that's false and disturbing about it, because it's representing several decades as if they appeared in a single year. So it would be pleasing for me to say that Written Here and There kicked off in early April for reasons other than Borland's, because mine does begin on April 1st. To begin with the sense of natural rebirth and to emerge from winter by the book's end. But in fact, the first entries were written without any conscious thought of seasonal symbolism or appropriateness, and the unwitting nudge from Alan Cooper was fortuitous, not deliberately timed. In the end, I considered the timing of the book's beginning a stroke of luck attached to the season of budding, leafing, and blossoming. So it's not like I thought, okay, this has got to start in the spring. That's just when it happened. Okay, skip a bit here. One difference between the 17-syllable norm for Japanese haiku, or the 14 lines of a sonnet, and the Facebook character limit, you could say, is the difference between hundreds of years of poetic tradition and a decision made by a billionaire non-poet named Zuckerberg. Yet in practice, a limit length is a limit length, and is there any rock-solid reason to declare categorically that 14 lines of iambic pentameter are inherently a finer vehicle for concentrated expression than 420 characters of prose? Now, some might argue. I would argue, no, I don't think. When Facebook indicated that an entry couldn't be posted because it was, for instance, 428 characters, I'd pore over a paragraph and find 8 characters to let go of. In a playful spirit, I enjoyed the challenge and the game. It was a great kind of discipline. With this experiment, while this experiment used Facebook as one of its homes, it also persistently resisted several Facebook conventions. Politically, that is, as an activity implicitly putting into question many characteristics of a social networking medium. The calendar went against the grain of common usage in several ways, other than always bringing in images from non-human nature. To begin with, it was grounded in paragraphs rather than in the single sentence or fragment postings so common in Facebook. And all the posted entries were handwritten and revised first in a journal. So I would have people, when they found out what it was, you write your Facebook entries before some people thought this was just so bizarre. To consider Zuckerberg's invention as only one of the calendar's homes, its adolescence, as it were, it suggests metaphors of the journal as the calendar's birthing place in infancy, and the publication of bits of it in various periodicals as its next stage of life, and then the book as its maturity. One of the more curious ways in which this nature writing pushed back against Facebook occurred in the summer of 2011, after Zuckerberg and company abruptly removed the 420 character limit for updates. If you remember that, the shock of that. You imagine how shocking it was for me when I was posting all these things limited. One day I post it and it's letting me put on 400, oh, what are you doing? You're letting me put on 480 some characters. After having fit nature calendar entries within strict parameters for about 15 months, I was in the thought-provoking comical position of silently protesting the termination of the space limit. That's like being told that baseball diamonds can now have 6 bases. Having developed a particular sense of form and scale in creating and polishing so many paragraphs, I wasn't about to abandon the factor of length. So for the final 9 months of the writing, I maintained a model of 420 characters, but now it was only a model and a less exact one, with no Facebook monitor left to indicate when 420 characters had been exceeded. I simply used a tried and true visual sense of how long the paragraph should be. So it wasn't like I was sitting there counting, I had a rough sense. And I have a funny paragraph here of a Luddite friend who was horrified at the whole thing and liked the writing, but This is someone who doesn't have a computer. Ned has never owned a computer. And so he said he liked the writing, but echoing the end of Huckleberry Finn, he said to me, come back to the raft. the idea that I was embracing civilization too much by using Facebook and other means. In response to that, I wrote that in light of such questions, it later felt affirming to learn that in confronting things like the publicity machine, the celebrity circus, the ever more intrusive media, the Dalai Lama believes, in Pico Iyer's phrase, everything in the world can be used for some good. Many of the calendar's characteristics grew organically and might be called the fruits of observing, recording, and asking questions about natural phenomena over 2 years. Part of the enjoyment of the writing was the unexpectedness of what the days offered within the severe restrictions of one life. If something of a catalog quality entered the project, maybe that's because while nature is supremely beyond summarizing and cannot be fully encompassed by anyone what theists say about their God, the only way we can pay it anything like comprehensive attention is paying for variety, even if the end product is bound to be a slim, even farcically stunted product compared to the cosmos in which it occupies one tiny corner. For the sake of difference in breadth, some days I consciously directed myself to write not only about birds, mammals, trees, and flowers, but also about insects, fishes, amphibians, gardens, poetry, newspapers, dogs, clouds, constellations, etc. Yet most of the time such directing was unnecessary, and references to various phenomena entered the Book of Days primarily because I was encountering them as the days passed. Lyrical field reports aren't the only sort of entry. Surely 366 consecutive chunks of poetic prose would have been too much lyricism, like eating strawberries for breakfast, lunch, and dinner day after day. So the boundaries of the project expanded beyond prose poems, a tricky term to define in any case, to paragraphs better described as musings, stories, humorous anecdotes, satirical sketches, abridged quotations, or collages of quotations, and meditations on language. Here are a few examples of the last. May the 1st. In Hants County, drove past sign Meander River. Love at first sight for the name and the glimpsed flash of water. Imagine being born on the banks of a river named Meander. Later did research. Verb meander comes from Boyak Menderes' Meander River in Turkey, first mentioned in Homer's Iliad. So in the beginning, the river wasn't named after the verb was named after the river. And anybody knows anything about Calgary? This will ring a few bells. June the 10th. In a city that includes Crowchild Trail, Many Horses Road, Chestnut Walk, Cactus Ridge, Hidden Brook Crescent, Hawkwood Boulevard, Apple Creek Circle, Canyon Meadows Drive, Coral Reef Link, Meadowlark Road, Sanderling Rise, Sandpiper Mews, Canoe Square, and Wilderness Place. Subdivisions grow, new glass is cut and raised, and real estate agent signatures multiply like sparrows' claw prints in the overturned earth. June the 11th. Sitting on moss and needles, I photograph a red-bellied polypore. Hot, thirsty, I rest, browsing through the mushroom guide. Where are you, bleeding, agaricus, slimy, amphibious, fetid, marasmius? I may never see you once, amethyst, tallow, cinnabar, red chanterelle. The names make me waxwing full of fermented berries drunk. Hey, where are you, black, earth tongue, gold gill, navel cap, dryad, saddle, salt shaker, earth star? June 12th. Here names slip and slide. Wake robins aren't birds, but red trilliums under another name. Reindeer moss is not moss, but lichen. Meadowlarks are not larks, nighthawks not hawks. Rabbit, snowshoe hare. Partridge, ruffed grouse. Sweet fern is a sweet-smelling shrub, not a fern. Hen of the woods, a mushroom, lays no eggs. And the screech owl doesn't screech, but trills and whinnies. Names slip, slide. Tim Lilburn's poetry collection, Moosewood Sandhills, is grounded in a 2-year stretch of time he spent getting to know a desert-like area of Saskatchewan, walking the land, observing the grass and birds and changing weather, sometimes sleeping in coyote dens or deer beds. At the beginning of the book, Lilburn writes, "Looking with care and desire seemed a political act." Though the verb seemed may claim less than was, Lilburn's statement as it stands draws a connection between politics and attentiveness, attentiveness working along with desire, but desire partnered with care, thus rescued from being mere possessiveness. We don't have to read far into Lilburn's book to realize that the verb looking, in fact, stands for a range of engagement. That is, looking, listening, smelling, touching, and tasting, and reading and thinking with care and desire seemed political acts. This sort of subtle yet broad appreciation of politics has informed my 2-year project. Our hopes of raising green consciousness in many children and adults often begin more in the sensuous, the feel of brook water rushing over our ankles, the sight of a fox fleeing into underbrush, the sound of a barred owl suggesting the uncanny, than in conservation-minded newspaper or TV items or environmentalist blogs or public speeches. The overtly political is crucial, necessary, life-saving, but it needs to remain rooted in and sustained by emotional attachments to the realities of earth, air, fire, water, and other beings. A deep love for the high beauties, never to be encompassed diversity, and vitality of nature are crucial for a lasting commitment to curbing our human tendencies to misrepresent, abuse, and truncate the source and home of our existence. Recently, I came across a statement by E.B. White in a 1969 interview made in a very different context, America's national crises and international policies, that could easily summarize the conflict felt by many nature writers. "I rise in the morning torn between a desire to improve or save the world and a desire to enjoy or savor the world. This makes it hard to plan the day." Since only human vanity could lead us to think that we have the power to single-handedly improve or save the natural world, which is unfortunately more complex than, which is unfathomably more complex than any of our technologies, White's word choices might be replaced with respect and more active defend, that is opposed to improve and save. It appears to set up a division between enjoyment and advocating. Yet in the end, we don't have to feel so torn, since our most constructive approach might be to keep reminding ourselves of the interconnection between sensuous poetic alertness and environmental ethics. Part of such ethics is awareness, astuteness, and appreciation that keep our talk of nature from being too joyless and too abstract. To say that artists are artists when they do their art and polemicists when they are citizens is oversimplified and misleading. It's more useful to say that the artist's citizens' activities and voices vary. For instance, along with its uses of description, narration, metaphorical playfulness, and celebration, and nature can sometimes rise to speak its mind in more public ways. And you will recognize a certain ex-mayor of Halifax in this one, September the 16th. Wanting to prove the harbor is clean in yellow and black swim shorts, the mayor wades in, then goes underwater. Reporters and other citizens gaze. The new sewage treatment plan, costing $54 million, broke down last year. Bad press. To drown bad press with good press, the mayor gets wet in his bumblebee-colored suit. In the water, he keeps his lips shut perfectly tight. October 10th. The sun chip bags, says an AP news story, were launched with a big marketing effort to play up their compostability because they're made from plants and not plastic. Now Frito-Lay, hearing complaints about the rattling and crackling, withdraws the biodegradables. In ye old fickle market, plastics have trounced plants, Frito-Lay is weak-kneed, and the sun chips I ate the other day tasted a little off and odd. January 13th. So pleased to bring this abundance home. Then in our Nova Scotian kitchen, the labels say the strawberries are from Florida, the raspberries California, the blueberries Chile, and the blackberries Mexico. I toss them together for waffles and fetch the bottle reading pure Nova Scotian maple syrup, Westchester, NS. Like locavores' thickened tears, the syrup flows down the hills of berries. March 30th. In Thailand and Malaysia, meticulous swiftlets build nests from their saliva. The sticky wetness dries and hardens. Meanwhile, the illegal trade in bird's nest soup is up to $500 million a year, and men on bamboo ropes strip cave walls bare. Those nests provide no taste or nutrition, yet tradition is in the saddle and whips us on. Didn't the swiftlet already give us enough, merely in being one who makes crystalline cradles from its own spit? So I'll skip a part about sort of the whole idea of the semi-fictionalized single year, the task of combining 2 years into 1 year. One thing I mentioned is that there are very rare cases in which matters of public record have been condensed in time. The notorious Gulf of Mexico oil spill from the spring of 2010 and the disastrous tsunami and earthquake in northern Japan, spring 2012, are alluded to as if they happened within less than 12 months. In the end, I trusted that the product of a shaping artistic consciousness had its place, different from the place provided for a record fastidiously following facts adhering to their historical dates. Close to the end here. No doubt it would be possible to group these mini prose pieces thematically, to come up with sequences based on portraits of various birds, or the activities of insects, or agriculture and food, or nature and art galleries and paintings, or children and nature. But such groups would fundamentally transform the experiment, the day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month unfolding of the year, involving a constant shifting of encounters and attention, a year experienced less as a series of boxes than as an interweaving. On the other hand, a book of days is not only a book to read by starting at page 1 and persisting to the end. Another option is to flip pages, open the book anywhere, experience it erratically and randomly rather than sequentially. So this talk will conclude as it began, with a few entries of varied sorts, but this time jumping back and forth among the months, dipping into the calendar here and there. The British Columbia poet Rita Wong begins a poem sequence. Faith hides in little pockets like the heart and the throat. At the risk of making too extravagant a metaphor, I'm hoping that this book of days can be compared to a coat with 366 little pockets of faith, even at a time when hopes for the future of this planet are so under threat. June 30th. In a thin rain, Norway maples drop their two-winged fruit onto the sidewalks. At 16, I wrote a love poem comparing such chimeras to the words of a girl who decades later died by her own hand. Then a song sparrow's voice takes me further back to the days when I first read a 75-cent paperback of Silent Spring. The chimeras shine in the sunflower, but some bird might sing bitter, sweet, sweet, bitter, sweet, sweet. May the 2nd. Turning from the megastores of Bayers Lake Industrial Park, a brief trek into the world of blueberry and lavender tea bushes, then on flat stone openings, 3 wannabe Inukshuk. Towers of rock whispering, disheveled, the wilderness lied, bow down. What strangers rolled and lifted the rocks, then gathered sticks to insert as the arms of a man? Those arms have no hands, so they offer no seeds to the winds and the finches. May the 30th. Today, when I took our car to the vet, the cage's rusted door fell. Rust eats a hole in the wheelbarrow. Rust invades the backyard shed and discolors the rake. Rust weakens the rakes in the backyard, spikes in the backyard of the abandoned, backboard of the abandoned basketball net. Man, I'm noticing a lot of typos that are distracting. The shed's door latch, the propane tank, the croquet wickets, rusted. Once I found a lost watch in a park. In this ocean-eyed realm of oxide, rust was gnawing on the hands of time. January the 15th, this one I can credit my kids largely with this one. In Pets Unlimited, a scarlet macaw steps sideways, back and forth along a short perch. A cocker spaniel presses his nose against a mesh. By jars of Siamese fighting fish, two children argue. That one's dead. No, it's not dead. Yeah, floating means you're dead. The other one's lying on the bottom, but it looks dead. Maybe they're both dead. They shouldn't be called Pets Unlimited if they're dead. February 20th. This ends with a Mi'kmaq tale, or very abridgment of a Mi'kmaq tale. The rare common gallinule is still at Red Bridge Pond. When cold and ice expand their rule, a rescue party of 6 arrived with hip waders, nets, and a kayak, but the reed lurker proves elusive. Too much fuss over one bird, says one online skeptic. Look at the big picture. A man spreading chopped greens, fish cakes, and canned salmon shares a childhood tale of hummingbird helping douse a forest fire, one beakful of water at a time. Now, as I mentioned, some of them are kind of collages or condensed journal passages. This is from a condensation of a passage from Emerson's journals in 1841, September 30th. The metamorphosis of nature shows itself in nothing more than this. There is no word in our language that cannot be typical to us of nature. The world is a dancer. It is a rosary. It is a torrent, a boat, a mist, a spider's snare. The metaphor will hold and give the imagination keen pleasure. Swifter than light, the world converts itself into the thing you made. There is no thing small or mean to the soul. A couple more. May the 6th. Against the tapping of fine leaves on moss, leaves, twigs, and logs, light bells are ringing here and there. A junco flips up and down branches of a young spruce rooted in a nurse stump. White bordering tail feathers flick against its grave. What insects stir within the woodrot? Bells interspersed with subtle rain, those clear voices from all corners of the compass. Each nurse stump deserves a junco ringing. And September 8th, beyond Sambro Island, 20 kilometers out to sea, I saw a Manx shearwater for the first time. Or the avian aficionado I've heard has the sharpest eyes in the province called out, Manx shearwater. Then, for less than a second, I managed to spot the dark, long-winged bird rushing over distant, sun-dazzled crests and troughs. But did I see a Manx shearwater? I glimpsed one, or even less, was told I glimpsed one. So if you have any questions about the writing of this book and about the genre, I'd be happy to answer if I can.
Thank you. Comments, questions? I'm going to start with one then. Nature writing, nature calendar. And but what you've also included, what you've described, are also what I would call kind of thoughts on environmental issues, you might say, as opposed to strictly nature, like the oil spill or events like that. So just maybe this is a technical question in a sense, but how do you separate nature writing and sort of environmental writing, or do you?
I don't think today you do anymore.
Yeah.
It's become impossible to separate the two, and I don't think any quote unquote, I mean these are just labels, but I don't think any nature writer today does not deal with environmental crisis. If they do, they're hiding their heads in the sand. 50 years ago or 100 years ago, it was perhaps easier to do that, but it's almost non-existent now. You don't find people writing about nature who aren't aware of its loss and of the threats to it.
So is that reflected? I'm not sure of the dates exactly of the books here, but Do you see that in, like, when you were referring to the 40s to 60s, somebody who was writing about the 40s?
Well, Colross Petey is kind of between the wars, so he's talking also about culture, in the aftermath of the Depression and things like that. Not so much environmental crisis, but the subtitle of Fred Rage one is actually an environmental book of days. But see, the Edwin Mayteal ends in the early 60s, so there's not, there are touches, but not a lot of overriding concern. Not so much in these books of days, but certainly in plenty of other examples of nature writing, Canadian, American, British, yeah. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. And I enjoy taking photographs. It's a passion of mine. And I always think of nature photography and environment photography. It's a false separation of labeling that, because if you're taking a picture of nature, a beautiful bird, a flower, you're thinking, okay, that moment is just perfect, so I take that photo, and that's fake. It should be more, for nature photography, more situational, I guess you would say. My comment overlapping in your thoughts of separating the two styles of writing between nature and environment, and if I can add a question onto that, if you were not on Facebook, would you go ahead with the project regardless?
Very, well, that's a very hypothetical question. That's the way it evolved. Hypothetically, I certainly could have done it without Facebook. Since then, I've completed another manuscript, which is all much longer. I wanted to move into much longer forms, because after doing those minute things for 2 years, I wanted to move to longer journal entries. And I've got interested in the idea of plein air, of the tradition in painting outdoors. So I drafted the entire book outdoors, sitting by 50 different bodies of water, lakes and bays and waterfalls and rivers, swamps. 2 of them actually take place in a bathtub. They're the only 2. they're the only 2 in which I cheat. They're not outdoors.
Where's water, right?
So there's 48 are plein air or outdoors, and 2 of them are indoors, but they have the water. They have the water connection. So, there was nothing in Facebook that determined the entries in that book. I just wrote as much as I want. And now, interestingly, I've continued. I posted all of it on Facebook just because I had quite a few friends who had followed the nature calendar and were interested in seeing the new project. And one thing I liked about that, just as a writer, is that it gave me the discipline to revise quite quickly. My first drafts, I revised quite quickly, whereas if I hadn't had that Facebook thing, I would have let the rough drafts sit for months and months and months. And this way, because I knew they were going to be read by a few people, I worked hard to get them revised enough that I felt they were readable. But then once all 50 were completed, I then went back and did lots more revising.
The community aspect of Facebook was quite important then.
Yes. It gave encouragement, and for the project overall, it added quite a different dimension, which unfortunately is not part of the end product as a book. That would have been a different thing altogether. If the book had included responses by people, sometimes it would be natural observations, and people would comment on a time when they saw this or that, or they would be curious to know more about this thing, and some people would provide links and so on. So that was a whole other life that the project had. I've been meaning to actually, I don't know how one does it, but I would like to salvage some of that, but it's all just there in cyberspace, and I'm still enough of a Luddite that I would like to have that saved on paper archivally. So I'm thinking of going back 4 or 5 years in Facebook, and if I can, print off a lot of that so that I have it. And of course, when people withdraw from Facebook too, their comments disappear, I believe. When you withdraw, don't your comments disappear? No, they don't?
Just forever.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's nice to have something positive mentioned about Facebook. So many people are negative about, but it's a very powerful, positive tool, Facebook is. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation. I thought it was really inspiring. And something I noticed just now when you also mentioned the next project, you know, writing outdoors, and I would assume sort of experimenting a little bit with how the different places influence the writing and so on. And what I see of my colleagues sort of in the environmental field is, you know, who go out into nature and study phenomena and experience and, you know, nature in a way and so on, and then come back to write the scientific paper, trying very hard to exclude that experience from what's written. And there is a question that I'm kind of lost in. And now the third dimension with engaging with Facebook in your writing. So I was wondering how, I mean, did you feel that your writing process and what you were writing, apart from limiting it to 420 words, whatever, was influenced by that medium and aspects of that?
I was almost more conscious of being influenced by those resisting things that I mentioned, resisting things about Facebook, and so trying to do something different that I wasn't seeing a lot of. So I almost thought the influence was kind of more, other than the parameters of 420 characters, it was more of a negative influence of you know, wanting to write full-fledged paragraphs. Wanted to draft and carefully sculpt what I was posting rather than just have it very, I mean, other times I would be doing just random things that had nothing to do with the project, but that one project I was interested in kind of refining the kind of prose that one would post in Facebook. And some people do post very beautiful, thoughtful paragraphs in Facebook, but I think we'd all agree it's a minority. The interesting thing about the second project, the outdoor one, is that something that wasn't at all a part of the Book of Days, of course, was that I'm sitting here, I'm in this particular place, so, you know, there's that kind of Buddhist thing about being in the moment and mindfulness and all of that. But I didn't want to simply limit myself to what was in front of me, to what I was seeing and hearing and smelling and so on. So I let my mind wander all over the place. So I have flashbacks, I have memories and so on, but I kept wanting to come back to the immediate. So the entries, which are sometimes, you know, 5-6 pages long, will have this process of, they usually begin with what's immediate, and then they'll go away, and then they'll come back, and they'll go away, and they'll come back. And see, again, there's the improvised thing. I never knew what was going to happen. An ant might crawl up my leg while I was sitting there, or a blue heron might, you know, fly across my vision. And so often those things became the improvised part of the, well, it was mostly improvised. Now, occasionally I was taking notes at the back of my journal for things that I knew I wanted to include at some point. And I thought, well, that's also a part of it. I mean, that's the way our minds think. We store things up. And so I don't want to censor that as well. I want to allow myself to dip into the notes at back if there's, you know, a quiet 15 minutes when I don't see much or hear much. And with the painters too, you know, the plein air painters, the Impressionism before them, Turner and John Constable, they would very often, and more often than not, they did not finish what they were doing outside. They often took them back to their studios and did further work on them. And I thought that was kind of parallel to the process of revising. I didn't make up observations or include things that, you know, hadn't been there, but I certainly worked on the prose. And I allowed myself, even if I'd be driving for an hour from some location where I'd been sitting for 3 or 4 hours, and if things occurred to me there in the car on the way home, I'd sometimes insert those in the entry, because I thought, well, this is still part of the experience, and you know, I don't want to be too anal and put it all and say I can't leave the experiment open to including some rewordings or some further reflection that might have popped up in my mind in the next half hour or whatever.
Just wanted to thank you very much. It's actually gotten me thinking again about the importance of observation and the importance of also reflection. And as you were speaking, I'm realizing that, over the last 16 years or so, I've shifted more and more to focusing on the use of technology and observing the world around me, rather than doing when I was doing my doctoral work in a salt marsh in the Bay of Fundy. My advisor had said, we built a tower, and I sat there on the tower for 8 hours. The tide rose and fell. And he said, write your observations, what you're seeing. And over time, I feel I've lost that, and I'm also not encouraging my students as well to say, okay, this first day in the field, I don't want you to collect data. I want you to watch and observe and record. And so thank you for that. You sort of stimulated that spark of the power of just sitting and taking time, rather than thinking of number of samples or a satellite image or data crunching. The importance of that observation, so thank you.
The other thing is, the technology too, is that if I was more adept with technology, I could imagine myself sitting under the tree and Googling stuff and so on, but I didn't really want to do that. I would have, the one thing, again, books, I would have sometimes several guides with me in my backpack. So I would take the liberty sometimes to open a guide up, and I would consider that an organic part of the process. And I certainly wouldn't object to anybody else doing that on the internet, because it is, in a sense, the same thing. They're just using a different technology. But I didn't want to check things on my cell phone or anything. Books seemed to be enough.
One other kind of curiosity question about nature writing. Do you find now other nature authors, does anyone kind of record their, does everyone write, or do they sometimes dictate what they're observing and using that technology later on to transcribe? I'm just wondering.
You mean just to speak into a?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as a process, as a writer of nature, how has there been a change in how people are? Is everyone still sitting down and writing?
I imagine there's more use of mics and so on now, talking, for taking notes that way. I think for notes and notations, reminders and so on, it's one thing, but for creating complex sentences and complex reflections upon something, personally I find that very hard. That's talking into a mic. Other people may be very adept at it. I'm too attached to writing on the page, I think.
Any other questions?
If you're interested in looking at any of the books, they're up here. So
take a moment for that after. And Brian, I just want to ask you one last question.
Yes.
We talked, alluded to in addition to writing, to art and to photography. And I'm curious about music and songwriting in particular. Do you know if there are people that, sort of parallel to what you do, that specialize in writing songs of nature? I don't know of any who specialize in it. Certainly no particular songs that reflect environmental concern, but only in the sense of, a smattering of scattered songs, 1 or 2 songs by somebody. I imagine the process would be somewhat similar. I mean, it could
Yeah.
have been songwriting by the water
Yes.
in your bathtub.
Yeah. The great American polymath who was just in the news the other day, Wendell Berry, who I'm sure a lot of you have read. Wendell Berry, who's novelist, poet, prose writer, one of the greatest thinkers on small-time agriculture, and I think he's in his 90s now, maybe. He published a wonderful book that he did over several decades, and they recently collected all of these poems together, the Sabbath poems, poems that he only wrote on Sundays. And they were published in individual collections, and recently I just picked up at Bookmark. They brought those all together into a 300 or 400 page book. So that's a kind of interesting discipline, only to write on Sundays. And I believe he's a Christian. And I think he, on the other hand, he sort of jokes about, when the weather was good and nature was inviting, that's where he would be on Sunday. He wouldn't be in the sanctuary.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brian. That was great.